Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
It is I, the one, the only. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions that geeky gentlemen have made to history, but that have been ignored by a biased educational system, except not at all. I'm Sid Partu, joining me today is...
I'm Alfie, also known as the Brit Without Fear.
Indeed. So I had a open character discussion slot for History Month, and so I figured I'd ask Alfie to pick someone for us. Who are we discussing, Alfie?
Well, today we're discussing someone who will make his name quite heard, the one and only God of Thunder, Thor.
Indeed. Now, so the rules I line out for History Month are History Month character discussions are pretty simple. They have to be either consistently set within a historical era, or they have to have been created more than 100 years ago. So, you pick Thor, and he certainly qualifies for one of those criteria, but I have a sneaking suspicion this is just going to turn into a discussion on Marvel Thor.
Well, I don't know how much you know about the mythological Thor, but I'm quite heavily into Norse mythology, so I can go either way.
Okay, that's interesting, because no, I don't know much about Norse Thor. I really, really don't. And I've always kind of wondered in the back of my head, how much in common does he actually have with movie and comic book Thor?
More than you'd think.
Yeah?
Yeah, he's a much worse person, though.
Oh, good.
I always kind of think of it as like, myth Thor they've done quite a good job of, every time you have like a flashback in a Thor comic, or like even the Thor movies, to where Thor's an asshole, that's how he is in the myths, just always.
Okay.
We're always post-myth Thor into, okay, now he's going to try and humble himself to separate himself from all that baggage, which is interesting. You don't normally, like Hercules in comics is still like kind of, he's not to the same extreme, but he's still kind of a dick, whereas Thor's like actively trying to better himself.
That is a really good point, because like a lot of the stuff with Thor, it has that idea of being worthy of the hammer, right? And so just the way that's explored in the comics is often that he's very selfish and whatnot, and then like the hammer gets taken away from him, he gets humbled, and then he has to become worthy of it, and be a hero in that regard. And that's always, that is really interesting, that all the flashback stuff with Thor tends to paint him more like the original myth then.
Yeah, it's kind of taking, I mean, compared to the other Norse pantheon gods, like he is like known as the noblest and most trustworthy, but it's mostly just because he's so stupid that he gets into these problems, and like he falls for like Loki's tricks and stuff, which again is something that's carried over. Although like Loki's not his brother in the myth, Loki's Odin's brother, and but there's a close, that bond there, that rivalry there is like throughout all the comics. So like Thor just as a character, he's interesting just because even in the myths and especially in the comics, it's rare you find a character who's so versatile, who can do so many different tones, who can basically go anywhere with him. You can go from Kirby to the stuff that Jason Aaron's doing. Thor just kind of fits in everywhere, and especially like in team books, like he's just kind of a presence that I think explains why they picked up on the myth, because this idea of this champion of the people who still is just as flawed as the people he like tries to protect. I think it's more interesting because he's very much got that Marvel thing inherently in him, where he's kind of a bad person who's trying to do good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess like he kind of fits in well with someone like Tony Stark then in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned that he's really versatile, and I guess I hadn't thought of it that way because in the comics they do really use him kind of all over the place. You know, you got the classic like medieval almost style stories with Thor that you'll see in comics from time to time. And then you've got like just giant space epic stuff. So I think of Jason Aaron's first book in the Thor run, God Butcher. And it's like it starts with him, in like ancient Earth or medieval Earth, and then it cuts to him in modern day space visiting an alien planet, and it just kind of naturally works both ways, right?
Yeah, it's like the character, because he's so earnest and he's always so triumphant in what he does and these grand epic deeds. Because he believes so much in it, no matter what he's doing, you go along with him. Like Thor will like scream to Valhalla when he's like trying to save a cat from a tree or something. Like he's always going 100%. So it carries him no matter what situation you put him in.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, but let's focus a little more on mythological Thor, since I don't know that much about him. What to you is the defining trait of Myth Thor?
Myth Thor's defining trait is that he hits stuff super hard. You'll find this in like all the stories about him, and like the poetic Eddas that have been like gathered throughout history. Is the story? It is kind of like a precursor to superhero myth. He's the guy who comes in at the end and solves the problem by beating up the bad guys, or necessarily beating up the good guys sometimes. For his strength kind of is the key thing I define him by, simply because when you get into something like that stage of humans trying to write material, it is these kind of like primordial archetypes. We're not even at the generic like Superman archetype yet, but even before that, we're just like, this is strength as a person, and how would strength interact with people, how would like strength interact with trickery, which is like Loki. And you'll have all these really interesting stories that you can just picture in your head as being told in a Marvel comic today, of the time where Loki tricked Thor into trying to steal his hammer back from these trolls, and Thor had to dress up like a woman to go up to these trolls to get his hammer back. Or the idea of Thor fighting the world serpent in these grand cataclysmic battles is just, you can see them on splash pages, but yet these were already being told around just over campfires. He is just the idea of like the lightning bolt as this
destructive force.
Yeah, but also like destructive force to like give birth to new life. Like, as much as I am saying, because let's be honest, like Thor, there was this time where Thor's 2 goats were accidentally hunted. So then he killed the people and stole their goats to make his own new ones. And these were just like innocent people. Like, oh, sorry, Thor, we didn't know they were your goats. And he was just murdered them. So he's not super heroic, but at the same time, because of these myths, he is very much, he brings forth goodness in his wake, like a forest fire destroying everything. So then new leaves can grow, kind of idea.
Okay. Do you feel that the ideas, the myths behind Thor resonate today, or do you think it's kind of necessary to drastically change him for modern tellings?
I'd say no, because he's been successful and they really haven't. Like we pointed out earlier, they've added to him. They've developed him into more than just the barbarian. They've shown, okay, you're a barbarian for the first 1,000 years of your life. What are you for the next 1,000 years of your life? Like, we've really got into, okay, this guy's immortal. He will obviously have much longer periods of change. How can we get into that? So I feel that that's kind of the most necessary thing we've had to do. whenever you're adapting any myth and you're applying modern writing to it, I feel like the contents of like the myths aren't as important as just like, okay, let's turn these people into actual characters. Let's make these gods human in a sense. But apart from that, like I feel like again these stories are so entertaining and just a sheer like outlandish like again it feels something like Kirby would come up with, but it was way before his time.
Couple hundred years before his time.
Yeah, exactly. It's really crazy just how well they captured the spirit of the character. I really do struggle to think of other characters that have been adapted as well, as naturally as Thor, even because it's not like in the movies they try and like say, oh well, what you see is magic, we see is science. So there's kind of an element there of like Asgard. It's not on a plane of existence or like an actual world tree. It's like a planet that can be destroyed. Spoilers for Thor Ragnarok. If no one saw that movie, it made up so much money. I'm sure everyone did. But like in the comics, it's pretty much a straight take of Asgard, like Rainbow Bridge and all. And people buy it. People go for it. I feel like he is very much. You don't need to change as much, apart from trying to make him more likable and trying to make him more, I don't know, more in depth as a character.
Okay. It's interesting you mentioned like some of these stories just feel like things you'd see now, and you also mentioned Ragnarok there, because there's that scene in Ragnarok where they considered filming stuff for a flashback, and then they just decided it was too funny and they kept it as dialogue. And it was Thor talking about how he loved snakes and he picked up a snake and then it turned into Loki and started stabbing him. And I'm like, I'm so curious if that was actually a story that they just adapted into the screen, like just some random Loki and Thor adversarial story. And I doubt it is, but it does feel so natural. So it's funny to see that transition again there.
Yeah, that idea, I'll quickly interject because I do think it is the actual thing.
Oh, really?
It's not that, but I feel like Thor, and I don't know if people know this, but Thor and snakes have a very intimate relationship because Thor gets killed by a snake. Like Thor's death at Ragnarok is at the hands of the world serpent in like his final battle. So him saying "I love snakes" was really funny to me because his arch enemy throughout the whole series isn't Loki. Loki's just like the instigator, but it's the world serpent is the one he has all these fights with. So him saying he really likes snakes, I just thought was kind of ironic.
That's funny. All right. So you say the world serpent's more the classic rival to Thor. Where do you think the Loki fascination has really come from then?
I think it's just because Loki's the most interesting. Like, again, when you're making any story, especially nowadays, the most interesting villain is never the brute that fights the hero. It's the person who's in charge of the brute, and that's what Loki always was. He didn't have as many altercations before because he was kind of more Odin's deal. Like they weren't related. He was more of an uncle and just kind of around the other gods. But I think the idea to make them brothers was genius. I think it's such a good idea. We've obviously, history has spoken to that. We've got so much good just pathos to their relationship now between these broken sons dealing with their complete asshole of a father and trying to get out of that any way they can, and just on one succeeding and one not doing so well. I feel that there's a lot of there that's only served to add to it. And just Loki's, this idea of the shape-shifting trickster is like, he's almost a Doctor Doom or like a Lex Luthor in a way, where he's almost bigger than Thor because he can go do other stuff. He can fight other heroes and it's almost just as interesting, but then he can always go back to Thor as like the core.
Okay. See, it's really interesting because I guess it's just the way that these things kind of permeate the culture, right? I'd never ever heard before that Thor and Loki weren't brothers. I thought that was just always what it was.
I
that's
was just as
really
surprised as you are.
Yeah. That's so crazy. I had no idea. And this is the kind of thing I love on History Month. I get to learn things. Yay. Uh, so is Odin like the little I do know about Greek mythology is I know like Odin gave his eye away for wisdom and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
not Greek, Norse mythology, sorry. But Odin is Thor's father,
Yeah.
correct?
Thor has quite a few sons. Odin has quite a few sons, and so does Thor.
Yeah. Does does the relationship with Odin, is that carried over pretty well or is it drastically different?
Um, Again, you can only get so much out of because these are like translated and then retranslated and then retranslated stories, and we've got so many. There's so many like. I'd recommend if anyone else wants to know more about this and get like a much more insightful detail than I could possibly ever could, but still want a little bit of Britishness there. Go to Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology book. It's an absolutely brilliant read, and it just covers like every single basis. But again, he even says there's so much missing that a lot of it is filled in the gaps, and you don't know what is actually from the actual myths and what's from people who's interpreted the myths. It's just how these kind of things work. But so there's not actually a lot between Odin and Thor. It's normally just Odin telling him to go do something, and then Thor does it. There's no like, father, I want to impress you and become a good king. At least from what I've read, there's not a lot of that, which I do think is a flaw. Odin's kind of just like the generic father there. It's not like how Zeus is just kind of a right bastard. Odin's more similar to Loki because he's not really sitting on the throne of the gods ordering them all the entire time. He's more going out and just being a knowledge whore and just going out and trying to get as much information as he possibly can at the cost of other people. So I guess there is that kind of theme, is that they've kind of translated that in Odin's character, him being, he must know everything and therefore he's like super controlling. Like he restricts like Loki and Thor, and he needs them to go on this specific path that he chooses out for them. You see a lot of that with like his dynamic with Jane Foster, was like she doesn't fit into his worldview, so he's just like no. So there's a little bit of that, but again, no, Odin and Thor is not this great tragic father and kind of beautiful father-son relationship back in the day. It's just kind of there. It's just kind of, oh, Odin had one son named Thor, and he had a son named Balder, and he had his other sons. Odin is just kind of a man whore, so he doesn't have that much time with one son.
Just imagining like the come here boy, and then like 3 dudes show up. It's like, no, not you, the other one.
And then the entirety of the planet Earth turn their heads.
Yeah, pretty much. Oh man, that's funny. All right, so I don't know. I feel like at such a loss here because I'm just sitting here. I'm like, man, that's really cool, Alfie. Tell me more. That's really cool. Tell me more. And I don't have a lot of knowledge on Thor, so let me ask you this one.
Ooh.
Why has Greek mythology stuck around and been so much more of a cultural influence compared to Norse mythology? Because when you think about Greek myth and the way it's stuck around and been bastardized left and right, you got the Hercules Disney movie, you got like God of War, you've got like so many things that play with Greek myths, but nothing really touches Norse mythology that comes to mind, at least, except for Marvel.
Yeah, obviously you need to be way more talented than me to be able to figure all the actual definitive reason. But I can think of a couple of just factors off the top of my head. I think the main thing is the Greek myths are far more complete. Mm-hmm. We have far more of them. We have like complete tales of the Greek myth, especially like because of the Enlightenment period. We kind of got a lot more of people specifically going to like Greek philosophers, and then Greek became in vogue, and then people went into like all the myths around that as this kind of intelligent society that we should aspire towards. Whereas the North myths were kind of the barbarians in the snow trying to keep alive, survive. So there's like a difference in, I don't know, pedigree between how people view the characters. Like Hercules has a far more defined arc than Thor ever could. Thor just kind of does stuff, and then he dies. Hercules has like a beginning, a middle, end. Like you get to see his entire life basically, whereas Thor you just see like chunks. But no, I feel like, and then with the Greeks, you mentioned God of War. I think that's an interesting point because I feel like that's beginning to shift.
Yeah, the latest games had the Norse myth in it.
And I think that's indicative of like how we are as a culture now, specifically because of how big Marvel is. I feel like the Norse myths are starting to come back in a big way just because so many people are more invested in. We've kind of seen everything with the Greek style. Thor's so big now. Obviously, Hercules is like the most popular like fictional character that ever existed, like in terms of heroes, just from the history. But in now, more people would know more about Thor than Hercules. I'd say if you just asked a random person on the street, just because of osmosis.
I mean, they're going to know things that are wrong, but they'll know things because of the Marvel movies, right? Whereas I'm like, name 3 of Hercules' tasks to any random person, they'll be like, fought a dog? Yeah, Hydra, something like that. Yeah, you got a really good point there. So it's interesting to realize that like the lack of knowledge on my part, at least, of Norse myth has probably something to do with the fact that it's just not been that it wasn't as well kept. I didn't know that. I just assumed it just got recorded and passed down the same way, and yeah, it was kind of dumb of me to assume.
Yeah, the Christians try to make sure it didn't, as they do with everything.
yeah. I mean, like that should be entirely obvious because you think Norse myth is bad. Try to look up anything about like Mayan or Aztec myth. You're gonna be like any sources you have are incredibly colored by what people were willing to translate, and then those languages were lost for centuries. So that's a really, really interesting point on the way in which that happens. Because I was wondering if you thought it maybe had something to do with Thor and Odin, Loki, and that whole bunch just not being as... I don't want to use the word tormented, but like I've read other myths from similar eras to like Greek history or Greek mythology. Like I've read some Egyptian myths and stuff. And they're always like they do always seem like pretty basic, pretty what's the word I want here? Pretty surface level.
Yeah.
Whereas the Greek myths often have a lot of pathos to them. They often have a lot like of deeper meanings and connections. And I was wondering if you thought that like the Norse myth, while cool, just doesn't have some of that more human condition talk going for it.
Yeah, I'd say in general, if you just looked at like if you took one of like the adventures of Thor and Loki, like thingy, or how Balder died and he just gets killed by a bit of mistletoe because it's the only thing his mother didn't swear not to harm him. It's like it doesn't really, that's it, like there's no like moral at the end of it. It's just, oh, he died. So I think that's part of it, but I also feel like again, I'm going to reiterate, a much smarter British man, Neil Gaiman, said the reason why he was most fascinated by Norse myths is because they were the only ones where the entire myth had an ending, where all the gods died. Because a Ragnarok is just something that there's an end to just the whole, not just to one person or one aspect, but every god dies and then there's a rebirth, which is surprisingly awfully similar. Like if you looked at how Ragnarok like definitively ends, there's 2 people left on Earth, a man and a woman, and then Balder's resurrected. There's this one god over them who rules over them, and he's wholly good. And I'm thinking, Christians, did you do a little bit of thieving? I see.
Oh man,
it's just very, very strikingly similar there. especially because there's a garden and yeah. But I think Ragnarok is the one thing that kind of separates it. It's the one thing that, as much as I like Thor and Loki and Odin, if I'm being frankly honest, I wouldn't be as interested in those characters from like if I hadn't been exposed to the Marvel Comics version first, because then I've got a basis. I can like, like when I read Thor, I'm just like, oh, this is just a backstory now. It has nothing, completely different characters, but in my head, it's all one universe. This all happened. But like, I feel like that is what separates it. Is it's not as intellectually stimulating. It's not as, like you said, it doesn't have that kind of deeper meaning that you can analyze and then say, okay, but what does this mean for the times and stuff? Because the people, like again, it is that kind of, they're two different cultures who come up with these, and you kind of have to feel a myth by what kind of culture we're making it. These people were hungry. These people didn't know they were living in the middle of the snow and just dire winters. They had no society. They didn't know if you're going to live or die the next day. So they created this god with a mighty hammer who could defeat any foe. They created like Loki, who could shapeshift into any form and you couldn't trust anyone. They created Odin. He's not the most powerful god. Like Thor's stronger than Odin, but Odin's the wisest god, and that was the most powerful thing back then. It was knowledge. If you knew something, you could change the world. So I do think there is this kind of, it's just morbid. It's like you normally have an afterlife, but to say, oh no, the afterlife dies too. Like all the realms die in Ragnarok. It's kind of a shit show. Don't let the movie fool you, folks. There may be a kicking soundtrack to this happening, but it's not going to end well.
This one's a real downer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it ends with a. Anyway, all right, so, you made me think of one other thing. I can't remember what I read this in, but I read this comic. It might not even been a Thor comic. It might have been just a comic that Thor was in. There's an Old Norse myth about Loki sleeping with a horse.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Loki's nickname is Loki, Father of Monsters.
Yeah.
Loki fucks tons of messed up shit. Like he's Hela's father. He's the World Serpent's father.
Oh, well, that's good.
So I transformed into a snake and stabbed my brother. It's a lot less. I fucked a horse and then it gave birth to a snake that can wrap itself around the entire earth and then killed you.
That's funny. No, I just remember this one comic where they talk about like Loki fucking a horse, and he's like, "So what's going on with that?" And Thor's just like, "We do not discuss that." So I don't know. It's just funny to see how that stuff gets referenced again. But no, man, this is a lot of fun. I learned something new today. So when we talk about Thor, then for recommendations, I'm gonna cheat and I'm gonna say watch like, I don't know, half an hour of the first Thor movie, skip Dark World, watch Ragnarok, and the Avengers movies are pretty good Thor content. Now you don't get to cheat. You have to name actual historical stuff or things about like myth Thor as opposed to comic book Thor. So what do you got for us, Alfie?
Well, again, the biggest source I could give you is the aforementioned Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. There's so many scattered myths, and a lot of it is told through how you interpret it. That's kind of the beauty of it. These stories are meant to be told by other people. You're meant to tell them as stories to friends, and then you're allowed to misinterpret them. You're allowed to change details because that's what they did. And that's why they're so inconsistent. But that's also kind of the beauty of them. Like there's a new story every time. So definitely that. In terms of other mythological Thor stuff, I recommend there's a good series on YouTube, which I like. The name entirely escapes me, but I think it's Myths Disassembled or Simplified or something. But I think it's a brother and sister, and they do use like short animated collages on YouTube about different stories. They recently did a Lovecraft one for Halloween. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure someone can write in the description that Ian could later what the actual thing is. More work for him. But like,
I'm not doing that.
look
On
it
your
up,
own,
you'll
folks.
find it.
Overly sarcastic productions.
Um, you could find on YouTube. They do like a series on Ragnarok, which I thought was really interesting.
Okay. All right, everyone. Well, thanks very much for watching this episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher,
And I'm Brit Without Fear.
and we are your Geeky Gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.